All right. Hey, everybody. My name is John Hillgass. I'm a director of software engineering at Fidelity Investments. A quick disclaimer, even though I work at Fidelity Investments, we actually aren't using this tool. I'm speaking today using my experience as a custodian project maintainer, as well as previous work experience as an engineer and security leader at Capital One. All right, so let's get into the talk. What are EventBridge pattern filters? They're conditional criteria that we can use in rules to allow us to decide whether or not we want to route events from the event bus to a destination. In this case, we're only talking about Lambda because that's what is native to the custodian. Outside of the tool, though, you might have different destinations like Kinesis Firehose or an SNS topic. I've included a few doc links for anyone who wants to explore the source documentation more later. So how does this work? Here when you run a CloudTrail mode policy in Custodian, it deploys a Lambda with the Custodian package wrapped in a handler for an entry point. And it also deploys an EventBridge rule that is used to trigger the Lambda. With EventBridge rule pattern filters, the Lambda is only triggered by events that match that pattern. So here's an example of how one of these transactions might occur, or flow, for a better word. On the left, we have an event. It's just a regular CloudTrail event generated by an EC2 source. In the middle, we have a rule with a filter, and you can see there's request parameters, a resource set, items, resource ID, and a prefix. We're looking for prefix matching SG. We only want to match events that are generated by tagging security groups. And after that, we have a routing decision, a decision about whether or not to pass that on to the custodian Lambda. This filter is kind of interesting because EC2 has actually grouped all of its tagging events together in the one CloudTrail event type. The only differences are in the recorded resource IDs and user agents. We can see that this event was generated by ECS and is tagging ENIs, but the source event is registered as EC2. It gets kind of confusing. So the pattern filter here is written to only match security group tag events. And given this input, since it is a tag event for an ENI, we would not forward it on to that Lambda. Let's get back to this in a moment. This is a clearer picture to help you see how the Lambda and event triggers are linked. We have a filter that would only match create and delete tag events affecting security groups, where the change is to tags prefixed with C7N, because sometimes you might have implementation-specific naming conventions, or a tag key of network classification. And I've included this just for purpose of the demo. Let's pretend it's something network-specific and should be reevaluated when changed. Take note that the pattern on the left is stored and the AWS side is JSON. We'll see it differently in a moment. On the left, we have my terminal, where you can see the deployment outputs. These outputs are rather simple. We're just deploying a CloudTrail base, also known as Lambda policy. We also have ASCII art of a character called Trogdor. Trogdor. I had to say it, because why not? I was a big Homestar Runner fan growing up, and if you haven't seen this before, you need to check it out. It should still be all over YouTube. On the right, we have contents of the policy being deployed. In the previous slide, you saw the same pattern represented as JSON, but in the custodian policy, you write it as YAML because that's the format of the DSL. Later on, when deploying this policy, the internals will convert this over to JSON, because that's what it takes to keep EventBridge happy. Okay. This all sounds cool, John. But when can we actually use it? In the previous examples, we have a great use case. The EC2 create tag and delete tag event is used for all EC2 components, such as security group, instances, and ENIs. So we actually need to use this pattern filter if a policy requires looking at specific resources or tag keys and values. Another use case might be to help prevent recursion or ignore changes made by trusted processes. Time for a story. Not too long ago, in a previous role, this is a custodian confession. I ran a policy that was checking for the usage of a specific encryption key. And in the absence of that encryption key, the remediation action, which should have been to encrypt it with the missing key, actually, there was a typo. I fat fingered it and ended up writing it as encrypt it with another key. So you had a policy that was looking for events, encryption events. If it's missing a key, it would tag it with another key. You can see how this could fire out of control. Fortunately, this happened in a sandbox account, so it never entered into mainstream. But over the course of a couple days, we racked up millions of Lambda invocations from one policy. So be careful, this stuff happens. On the bottom of the slide, I've included an example of a pattern matcher that could have prevented this. Here we see we're looking for a user identity that starts with the prefix. This is just an example role. And maybe an example of a trusted process that you want to ignore events generated from. In this case, it would have prevented the recursion, but there's other use cases. Some operators might consider implementing this as a guardrail for certain kinds of risky policies. Anyway, that's it. That's all I have today. If anyone has questions, we've got about 7 minutes for that. And if we don't connect here, feel free to reach out on Gitter or the GitHub community discussions.
All right. Well, we appreciate your confession.
It's good to get it off my chest.
Let me look at the Q&A here. Okay, Anonymous asks, hi, John. My question is, where were you 1 year ago when I needed to know how to avoid recursion? I think that's more of a comment than a question. Yeah. But do you have any color to add to that?
I cannot recall when this was added. That might be a good Kapil question. It may have been added about a year ago.
Oh, that's interesting. We'll see if Kapil's still on chat. Thanks for that question, Anonymous. AIS says, I missed a few minutes. Sorry in advance. Where do the EventBridge events go when you configure them?
So they're set up when you deploy a CloudTrail policy. The Lambdas are configured to be triggered by the EventBridge rule. So when EventBridge sees something in CloudTrail, it'll forward it onto the Lambda. So they're forwarded to the Lambda. And then obviously you can still see them in the CloudTrail history.
And Kapil's here now, but missed a question. It was, when was recursion added? When was
the pattern filtering? I think that was a feature that was released sometime last year. I'd have to look back.
And they say, I asked because we built an elaborate ETL system and shoved stuff into Defect Dojo, which is an open source app.
Oh, interesting. Okay. To check that out. I'm not familiar with it.
We have the conferences. All right. Anything else? We have about 5 minutes until Liam comes on. Kapil says supplemental pattern filtering was either 2019 or early 2020. And then AIS goes on to say, we did the same thing with lambdas and forward events from all events and cleaned them up.
Cool.
Sadly, not sure government agency would let us show the public anymore. I feel
Totally
I hear
understand.
Let me see. We have time for maybe one question. One from Michael C. Weiss asks, is the goal of pattern filtering mostly to reduce cost by preventing lambdas from invoking unnecessarily?
That's just one of the use cases. I think potentially a more common one would be to zero in on things that are generated by the EC2 source events, because the way those have been designed, it seems like a lot have been grouped together into singular event types. The tags are a perfect example. So if you only wanted to look at tag changes to security groups or ENIs, you could zero in on those. And you know, there's a couple of use cases for that. You can prevent people from removing tags with the service control policy, but you cannot do that in the management account. So if you have like processes in there, potentially you could tag things. Sometimes there's a pattern of, hey, this thing's not compliant, let me tag it to review it again later to see if it's been fixed. If it hasn't been fixed, delete it. I've seen cases where people will actually remove the tag for future review when those controls aren't in place. And you know, in taking this approach, you can ensure the custodian's looking at a tag every time it's removed. And if it was removed in error, it could add it back, you know, little things like that. So a lot of potential applications.
Okay, Michael, I hope I answered